The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when I walked in, and the moment I saw my mother's handwriting on it, I knew something was wrong. I didn't say anything. That's the thing about growing up in my family. You learn very early that information is currency, and the person who speaks first spends first. So I set down my bag, took off my boots by the door, and poured myself a glass of water like I hadn't noticed a thing. I'm 31 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-size firm in Ottawa. My whole career is built on finding the thing that doesn't belong, the number that's slightly off, the signature that doesn't match, the timestamp that contradicts the story. I don't panic when I find a discrepancy. I document it. I verify it. I follow the thread. The envelope had already been opened. My name was on it, my grandmother's handwriting. And it had already been opened. I need to back up. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had lived in the same house in Kingston for 53 years. She was the kind of woman who kept her important papers in a fireproof box under the bed and still wrote checks for everything because she didn't trust online banking. She had a particular way of writing my name, always with a little flourish on the capital J, like she was proud of it. I used to tease her about it when I was a kid. She passed away in February, 7 months before that envelope showed up in my mother's kitchen. She had left me something. I knew that much because her lawyer, a dry, efficient man named Mr. Burr O'Carver, had contacted me directly in March to let me know the estate was being processed and that there was a specific bequest in my name. He'd been careful about the details over the phone, said he'd be in touch once everything cleared probate. I'd been patient. I had my own apartment in Ottawa, my own life. I wasn't waiting by the phone. But then my mother called in September and said she thought I should come home for Thanksgiving weekend. Said she missed me. Said my brother would be there and it would be nice to have the family together. My mother has never once in my life called to say she missed me without wanting something. But I went anyway, because my grandmother had just died, and I thought maybe grief was making her softer. It wasn't grief. I found that envelope on a Tuesday morning, the second day of my visit. I waited until my mother left to pick up my brother from the bus station. About 45 minutes, I figured. And then I sat down at the kitchen table and read every word inside. It was a letter from my grandmother. Handwritten, 4 pages, dated the previous November. She had written it knowing she was sick. She had written it knowing what my mother was like. The letter explained that she was leaving me $340,000. That was her entire savings, a combination of a small life insurance policy, the proceeds from selling a rental property she'd owned in the 80s, and decades of careful living. She'd worked as a nurse for 38 years. She didn't spend money on things she didn't need. She'd been saving my whole life without ever telling me. She also explained why it was specifically for me and not split with my brother. She wrote it plainly, without bitterness. My brother was 34 years old and had never held a job for longer than 8 months. My mother had been quietly supporting him for years. Rent, car payments, credit card debt, and my grandmother had been the source of a significant portion of that money. She said she loved her grandson, but that giving him more would be giving my mother more, and my mother had made choices she couldn't keep subsidizing. She wrote, "I trust you, Josie. You've always known what to do with what you're given." And then she wrote something that made my stomach drop. She said that she had discussed the bequest with Mr. Okafor and that the funds would be released to me directly, but that she had also written a personal letter to my mother explaining the decision. She wanted there to be transparency. She didn't want secrets. My grandmother had believed in honesty the way some people believe in weather, as a force that exists whether or not you acknowledge it. My mother had received that letter months before I did. I sat there at the kitchen table for probably 3 minutes, which felt like 30, doing what I do when I find a discrepancy, not reacting, just thinking. My mother had known since at least spring that I was inheriting $340,000. She had invited me home for a long weekend. My brother was on his way. The envelope had been opened. I put the letter back exactly as I'd found it, went upstairs and called Mr. Okafor. He answered on the second ring. I told him I was calling about my grandmother's estate and that I had some questions about the disbursement timeline. He paused, just briefly, and then told me the funds had already been released, 2 weeks ago, to a joint account that my mother had apparently presented documentation for, claiming I had authorized the transfer as part of a family trust arrangement. I had never signed anything. I had never been contacted about a family trust. I had never even heard the phrase family trust arrangement in connection with my grandmother's estate. I thanked Mr. Okafor very calmly and told him I would need to come into his office. He said that would be appropriate. I could hear something careful in his voice, like a man who'd just realized the floor he was standing on might not be solid. I hung up and sat on the edge of the guest bed, my old childhood bed, still with the same faded quilt, and I let myself feel it for exactly 90 seconds. The betrayal, the audacity, the years and years and years of small indignities, small manipulations, small ways my mother had always treated my brother's comfort as the household's primary goal, while treating my achievements like a resource to be extracted. And then I stopped feeling it and started planning. My mother and brother came home at noon. She had picked up sandwiches. She was in a good mood, which told me everything. She thought this was going to go smoothly. My brother, whose name is Danny, was loud and cheerful the way he gets when he's nervous and trying not to show it. He's not a bad person. He's just never had to be a good one. We ate lunch. I was pleasant. I asked Danny about a landscaping job he'd been doing, and he talked about it for 20 minutes, while my mother nodded and smiled and occasionally looked at me in a way I recognized, assessing whether I knew. I gave her nothing. After lunch, she said there was something she wanted to talk about. She said it gently, like it was going to be a favor she was doing me. She said she knew Mr. Okafor had been in touch, and she knew that grandmother had left me some money, and she thought it made sense for the family to discuss it together rather than have it cause any division. I said that sounded reasonable. She pulled out a folder. She had an actual folder. Inside was a document she called a family financial agreement, something she appeared to have had drafted by someone, though it looked amateur enough that I doubted it was a real lawyer. The gist was that the $340,000 would be held in a joint account, the same one the funds had apparently already been moved to, and dispersed according to family need. My brother's current debt load was described in the section titled Immediate Obligations. It came to $180,000. The document suggested this would be addressed first. She slid it across the table with a pen on top. She said, "It's what grandmother would have wanted. She always said family comes first." My grandmother had written 4 handwritten pages specifically explaining why she was not doing exactly this. I looked at the document. I looked at my mother. I looked at Danny, who was staring at the table with the expression of someone who knows he should feel worse than he does. And I said, "Can I have a day to read through this properly?" My mother hesitated. She'd wanted this done today. But she smiled and said, "Of course. Take all the time I needed." That night after they'd gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen with my laptop and my phone and I made a list. Here is what I knew. The funds had been transferred to a joint account without my knowledge or consent. My name had been used to authorize that transfer. In Ontario, that's not a creative interpretation of family finance. That's fraud. Specifically, it could constitute fraudulent misrepresentation to a financial institution, which carries serious civil and potentially criminal implications. Here's what else I knew. My mother had been managing a small hair salon for 12 years and had been paying some of her suppliers in cash, off the books, in a way that I had noticed at various family dinners over the years, but never engaged with directly. I also knew that her GST HST filings, which I had once glanced at when she'd asked me to just take a look at her books 3 years ago, had some creative interpretations of input tax credits. I'm a forensic accountant. I don't make accusations I can't support, but I also know what things look like when they look wrong. I called my own lawyer that night. Her name is Dr. Ferreira. She has a PhD in tax law and a very quiet voice that somehow makes everything she says sound like it's already happened. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, Don't sign anything. Don't tell them what you know. Come see me Monday morning." Then I called my bank and had a fraud alert placed on my accounts. Then I emailed Mr. Gerald Okafor and formally notified him that I had not authorized any transfer or joint account arrangement and that I was requesting full documentation of what had occurred, copied to my legal representative. I went to sleep. This is the part where people always ask, "Weren't you scared? Weren't you devastated?" And the honest answer is that I was. Somewhere underneath all of it, there was something breaking that had probably been cracking for years. But when you've spent your whole career learning how to stay calm in the middle of a mess, the training takes over. The daughter in me was sitting at the bottom of a lake. The forensic accountant was running the show. The next morning was Wednesday. I came downstairs and had coffee with my mother like nothing had changed. She asked if I'd had a chance to look at the document. I said I had some questions, but I didn't want to get into them until I'd slept on it. She said that was fine, though I could see the slight tightening around her eyes. Danny was still in bed at 10. He came down eventually in sweatpants and asked what was for breakfast. My mother made him eggs. I watched this and felt something clarify inside me. Clean and cold as a January morning in Ottawa. At 11, I told my mother I was going to run some errands. She offered to come. I said I needed some time to think. She accepted this. She needed me calm and cooperative, so she was being careful. I drove to a UPS store and made copies of every document in that folder she'd shown me. I photographed the envelope my grandmother's letter had arrived in, the opened envelope addressed to me. I sent everything to Dr. Ferreira. Then I called Mr. Drellers Okafor from my car and asked him directly to describe the documentation my mother had used to authorize the transfer. He was quiet for a long moment. He said there had been a letter appearing to bear my signature, indicating I was designating my mother as a co-trustee for the purposes of receiving the estate disbursement. He said it had come with a photocopy of what appeared to be my ID. I asked if he still had the originals. He said yes. I asked him not to destroy anything. I also, gently, asked whether he had verified the signature against anything on file from our previous correspondence. Another long pause. He said the proper procedures had been followed. I said I understood, and that I'd be in touch with him through my legal representative. When I got back to the house, my mother was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, and she looked at me with an expression I'd seen my whole life, the one that means she thinks she knows the shape of the room better than anyone else in it. She said, "Have you thought more about the agreement?" I sat down across from her. I put my bag on the floor. I kept my hands still. I said, "I'm not going to sign it." She blinked. Just once, quickly. Then her expression reorganized itself into concern. "Josie, I understand this is a lot to process, but Grandmother wanted the family to be taken care of. Grandmother wrote me a 4-page letter," I said, "explaining exactly what she wanted. You received a copy of that explanation in March." The concern shifted. Something harder underneath. Those were complicated family dynamics. "I've spoken to Mr. Okafor," I said. "I know about the transfer. I know about the documentation that was used to authorize it. And I've spoken to my own legal representative." Silence. My mother is not a stupid woman. She understood in about 4 seconds exactly where this was going. She tried 3 things in quick succession. First, she said I was being cold and legalistic about a family matter. Second, she said Danny's situation was desperate and that I could afford to help because I had a good salary and no dependents. Third, and this was the one that was supposed to work, the one she'd always kept in reserve, she started to cry. I watched her cry. I'm not proud of what I felt in that moment, which was almost nothing. Not because I'm a monster, but because I'd spent 31 years being managed by those tears, and something in me had finally counted them all up and closed the ledger. I said, "Mom, what you described to the financial institution, the co-trustee arrangement, the authorization letter, I didn't sign any of that. That's fraud. I need you to understand that clearly before we talk about next steps. She stopped crying. You wouldn't. I'm not threatening you, I said. I'm telling you what the situation is. The documentation is already with my lawyer. Mr. Okafor has been notified. What happens next is largely up to you. Danny had appeared at the top of the stairs at some point. I hadn't heard him come down. He was standing in the doorway to the living room now, and he looked, for maybe the first time in my adult memory, genuinely frightened. He said, "Josie, I swear I didn't know about the paperwork." "I know," I said, and I mostly believed it. Danny's many things, but organized isn't one of them. My mother sat very still. I said, "Here's what I want. I want the funds returned to an account in my name only within 7 business days. I want a written acknowledgement from you that you received grandmother's letter and that you understood the bequest was to me individually. I want the agreement in that folder destroyed," she said, very quietly. "And if I don't?" "Then my lawyer proceeds," I said, "and the CRA inquiry my accountant has already drafted gets filed." I watched her face do something complicated. The CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, is not a friendly word in my mother's world. She knew that I knew enough about her books to make a referral credible. She didn't know exactly what I had, but she knew enough to know she didn't want to find out. My mother said, "You do that to your own family." "I'm not doing anything to my family," I said. "I'm protecting what my grandmother left me." The room was very quiet. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. The furnace clicked on. Ordinary house sounds. My mother looked at me for a long time. I don't know what she was looking for. I don't know if she found it. She said, "I'll call my bank on Monday." I said, "I'll have my lawyer confirm the transfer by end of next week." I drove back to Ottawa that afternoon. I didn't say goodbye to Danny. He was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a cold cup of coffee, and I didn't think either of us had anything useful to say. I hugged my mother at the door because she's still my mother, and I'm still human, but I didn't linger. On the 416 going north, somewhere around Brockville, I started crying. Not from sadness exactly, more from the release of something I'd been holding for a very long time. The version of me that had spent 31 years waiting for my mother to see me clearly, to see that I'd worked hard and built something real, and that I had worth that wasn't measured in how useful I could be to the rest of the family. That version finally understood it wasn't coming, and letting go of a thing you've wanted your whole life is a particular kind of grief. I pulled over at the Owan route in Gananagay, sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Then I got back on the highway. The funds were transferred within 6 days. Dr. Ferreira confirmed the receipt. Mr. Ferreira confirmed the receipt. Okafor sent a formal apology and a detailed account of what had occurred, which we agreed to keep on file without escalating, since the money had been returned and he'd cooperated fully. The fraudulent documents are part of a record I hope never to need. I used $50,000 of my grandmother's gift as a down payment on a condo in Westborough. It's on the 3rd floor, which she would have called impractical, and it has a little balcony where I've started keeping a container garden. She was an extraordinary gardener. The rest is in a TFSA and a portfolio that Dr. Ferreira helped me structure. It's boring and sensible and growing quietly, which is exactly what my grandmother would have wanted. Danny texted me in December to say he'd found a job with a property management company. He seems to be trying. I texted back and said I was glad to hear it. We are not close, but we are occasionally in contact. My mother and I speak on the phone approximately once a month. She doesn't bring up what happened, neither do I. She's my mother, and I my grandmother's granddaughter, and those are 2 different inheritances. One I'm still working through, and one I will spend my whole life being grateful for. Grandmother wrote in her letter, "You've always known what to do with what you're given." I hope she was right. I'm doing my best to make sure she was. There's a moment I keep coming back to, sitting in that Owen Route parking lot outside Gananoque, crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years. Not because I'd lost something in that house in Kingston. Because I'd finally stopped pretending I hadn't lost it a long time ago. I think about my grandmother a lot. She spent 38 years as a nurse, saved carefully, spent quietly, and in the end wrote 4 pages by hand to make sure I understood that she saw me. Really saw me, not as a resource, not as the responsible one who could be counted on to absorb the consequences of everyone else's choices, but as a person who deserved something of her own. That kind of clarity, from someone who loved you your whole life, is not a small thing. It's the kind of thing that holds you up when the floor gives way. What I keep thinking about is how easy it would have been to sign that document. My mother had calculated it well. The family weekend, the sandwiches, the gentle voice, the folder that appeared as if it was simply a formality. She'd been reading me my whole life, and she knew the levers, guilt, loyalty, the exhausting hope that this time things would be different. If I hadn't spent years learning to sit with discomfort instead of resolving it too quickly, I might have picked up that pen. I almost understand the version of myself who would have. But here's what I've come to believe, and it took me a while to find the words for it. The choices we make under pressure are not separate from who we are. They are exactly who we are. My mother made her choices, and so did I, not because I'm harder than her, or colder, or because I love my family less, but because I had built something in myself that held when it needed to. A kind of internal structure, built from years of work and honesty, and refusing to let my own perception of reality be negotiated away. That's what my grandmother was really leaving me, not just the money. The money is real and it matters, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She was leaving me the confirmation that she had watched me build that structure, piece by piece, and that she trusted it. That kind of inheritance doesn't go into a TFSA. It goes somewhere else entirely. I didn't set out to punish my mother. I set out to protect what was mine, and to be honest about what had happened, even when honesty was the harder and lonelier road. Those are the things worth practicing. The courage to see clearly, the discipline to act from knowledge rather than fear, and the willingness to do the right thing even when the wrong thing would have been so much easier to swallow. I'm not always good at all 3, but I'm better than I was. My grandmother wrote, "You've always known what to do with what you're given." I'm going to spend a long time trying to deserve that sentence.